Livid Little Man here. How's it going, guys? It is October 25th, 2016. Let's talk politics. Here in Florida, we have four amendments that are coming up for vote on November 8th. We have Amendment 1, 2, 3, and 5. Let's go ahead and take a look at each one of these and see exactly what they're about. Alright, to kick this off, let's start with Amendment 5. It is titled the Homestead Tax Exemption for Certain Senior Low-Income Long-Term Residents Determination of Just Value. The summary is proposing an amendment to the state constitution to revise the homestead tax exemption that may be granted by counties or municipalities for property with just value less than $250,000 owned by certain senior low-income long-term residents, to specify that the just value is determined in the first tax year the owner applies and is eligible for exemption. The amendment takes effect January 1st, 2017 and applies retroactively to exemptions granted before then. The Herald Tribune, which supports this amendment, says the proposal states the elder residents who could be granted such an exemption could not have an annual income of more than $20,000 and must have lived in their home for more than 25 years. The amendment would help longtime residents with low incomes remain in their homes and enable them to keep more of their limited retirement income to spend on food, medicine, health care, and other basic needs. They say, we recommend voting yes for Amendment 5. And we have similar comments from the Cape Coral Daily Breeze and the Tampa Bay Times, all in support. Opponents of the amendment make the following statements. It would decrease property tax revenue needed to provide quality education. It would unfairly give lower tax rates to certain citizens based solely on age and duration of occupation. However, we are talking about senior citizens with a household income of $20,000. So any type of revenue that you're going to gain from that is insignificant and is only hurting those who are having to pay it. And it looks like the vast majority of people support this. Alright, moving on. Amendment 3 is titled Tax Exemption for Totally and Permanently Disabled First Responders. The summary is proposing an amendment to the state constitution to authorize a first responder who is totally and permanently disabled as a result of injuries sustained in the line of duty to receive relief from ad valorem taxes assessed on homestead property, if authorized by general law. If approved by voters, the amendment takes effect January 1st, 2017. Let's see. Bill was sponsored by Representative Larry Metz. Opponents of Amendment 3 will argue the establishment of a tax exemption for one's property separates taxpayers based simply on occupation. Opponents claim all taxpayers should be treated consistently and objectively with respect to taxation, with respect to a concept such as property tax rates and exemptions. The better solution would be to have rates set as low as possible for all taxpayers rather than disparate treatment dependent upon job categories. The Herald Tribune editorial board wrote the following. Amendment 3 would authorize a first responder who is totally and permanently disabled as a result of an injury sustained in the line of duty to receive relief from ad valorem taxes assessed on homestead property. The proposal would honor the sacrifices that police officers, firefighters, and other first responders make to serve and protect their fellow citizens. Now, for opposition, the Tampa Bay Times takes a different stance. They say the sacrifices made by first responders are without question, and they should be honored for their service, but each new exemption shifts the burden to the rest of the state's taxpayers to provide revenue for local governments and public schools. Instead of carving out more and more exemptions, lawmakers should be working to make the system fair for everyone. All right. Again, it looks like there's a lot of support for the amendment and very little opposition. I'm going to go ahead and say that I also agree with the amendment. We are talking about totally disabled individuals, people who are unable to become gainfully employed, and their lives have been permanently changed due to their duty in helping others. So, Amendment 3 is a yes. Next on the list is Amendment 2. Amendment 2 is titled Use of Marijuana for Debilitating Medical Conditions. The summary is as follows: allowing medical use of marijuana for individuals with debilitating medical conditions as determined by a licensed Florida physician. Allows caregivers to assist patients' medical use of marijuana. The Department of Health shall register and regulate centers that produce and distribute marijuana for medical purposes and shall issue identification cards to patients and caregivers. Applies only to Florida law, does not immune violations of federal law or any non-medical use, possession, or production of marijuana. The legal language of Amendment 2 was written to explicitly allow medical marijuana to be provided as a treatment for patients with the following specific diseases: cancer, epilepsy, glaucoma, HIV, AIDS, post-traumatic stress disorder, ALS, Crohn's disease, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis. Amendment 2 would also allow licensed physicians to certify patients for medical marijuana use after diagnosing them with some other debilitating medical conditions of the same kind or class as or comparable to those enumerated. The financial impact statement. Increased costs from this amendment to the state and local governments cannot be determined. There will be additional regulatory costs and enforcement activities associated with the production, sale, use, and possession of medical marijuana. Fees may offset some of the regulatory costs. Sales tax will likely apply to most purchases, resulting in a substantial increase in state and local government revenues that cannot be determined precisely. The impact on property tax revenues cannot be determined. All right, this is going to be one of the more controversial amendments in November. Arguments against Amendment 2 state that it's nothing more than a scam to legalize pot. Christina Johnson, she's a spokeswoman for the Vote No on 2 campaign. She says facts, research, and evidence from California's pot experiment proves that this so-called medical marijuana initiative failed miserably in its promises to the voters. Florida cannot afford to become the California of the East and have their history repeat itself in our state by buying into misleading rhetoric. Unfortunately, that's not accurate. There's a lot of people that are anti-pot. Well, the problem is we have such an epidemic of really bad drugs. And we're not talking about, cocaine. We're talking about prescription painkillers. And these companies that are pushing these pills are the same ones that are trying to fight against legalizing medical marijuana. Diane Ramsayer, executive director of a drug-free Charlotte County, expressed concern that legalizing medicinal marijuana would normalize the drug into recreational use. And she says, not even just for our teens, but our smaller children. When they start to see that, It just becomes normalized. It becomes that it's no big deal, and it's really a big deal. Their perception of risk of harm of using that is going down. It's only like 46% of our high schoolers that feel that any kind of harm in using marijuana. Well, see, that's another big thing, normalizing. Well, it has been normalized that people use prescription painkillers and pills to treat pain, right? This is absolutely no different, except you don't overdose. And we have such a huge issue with chemical dependency and overdosing from prescription painkillers. Arguments for it: United for Care listed the following arguments and quotations about marijuana's medical value. Studies have shown many patients suffering with HIV, AIDS, glaucoma, cancer, and chemotherapy, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, and other debilitating illnesses find that marijuana provides relief from their symptoms. Nausea, appetite loss, pain, and anxiety are all afflictions of wasting and can be mitigated by marijuana. Evidence not only supports the use of medical marijuana in certain conditions, but also suggests numerous indications for cannabinoids. Available prescription drugs often come with far more serious side effects than marijuana, and many patients who find relief from marijuana simply do not respond to prescription medications. Smoking or vaporizing marijuana are much more effective delivery methods than pills for many patients. The drug works instantly, the dosage may be controlled by the patient, and there is no problem keeping it down since it cannot be vomited back up. And cocaine, morphine, and methamphetamine may all be legally administered to patients, so why not marijuana, which has a far lower rate of dependency and for which there has never been a recorded overdose? And that is a very big plus. If you have a debilitating disease and you happen to need something other than painkillers, pain pills to treat your pain, such as medical marijuana, then so be it. Alright, and last but not least, we have Amendment 1. The title of Amendment 1 is Rights of Electricity Consumers Regarding Solar Energy Choice. The ballot summary is: the amendment establishes a right under Florida's Constitution for consumers to own or lease solar equipment installed on their property to generate electricity for their own use. State and local governments shall retain their abilities to protect consumer rights and public health, safety, and welfare, and to ensure that consumers who do not choose to install solar are not required to subsidize the cost of backup power and electric grid access to those who do. Now, this is probably the most controversial amendment, and the reason why I say that is because this is kind of an underhanded attempt by the power industry to reduce the rights of citizens. You have your supporters that are behind the Consumers for Smart Solar. Their argument is that it would guarantee the right of Florida residents to produce their own energy production, solar energy production, which that's already guaranteed. And it says it would protect every Florida consumer, including those who do not produce their own solar energy, and address undesirable solar business practices like third-party leasing. That is the thing. While this amendment sounds like it would be a good thing for consumers and those looking to get into the solar power generation, what you need to do is look at those who are supporting the amendment. In support of it, there is $21 million. And the top contributors, look at this: Duke Energy, Florida Power and Light Company, Tampa Electric Company, Gulf Power Company, 60 Plus Association Inc. I believe the 60 Plus Association Inc. is actually tied to the Koch brothers. But you notice these are the proponents. These are the people who want this amendment to go through. All of the major power companies want it to go through. And there's a reason for that. As far as main arguments, supporters argue that the first component of Amendment 1 would encourage the expansion of solar power by providing an explicit constitutional right to solar energy production, and the second component would allow consumers to be treated fairly by preventing them from being forced to subsidize solar energy. However, nearly 75% of campaign contributions in support of Amendment 1 were provided by electric companies. Opponents, however, argue that the second component of the initiative, which authorizes the government to ensure that people who decline to produce solar energy do not have to subsidize solar energy production costs, could be used to limit solar energy production and strengthen the power of the utility companies. Specifically, opponents express concern that lawmakers might be induced to prohibit the practice of net metering, which requires utilities to purchase surplus energy generated from solar-powered homes. Opponents also argue that the right of Florida residents to solar energy production is already protected by various regulations and agreements, making the first component of the amendment unnecessary. Some critics claim that Amendment 1 proponents included the provision protecting the right to solar energy production to make Amendment 1 look like a pro-solar measure, even though it could reduce the use of solar power. In opposition of Amendment 1, you have the Tampa Bay Times, which stated, "The wording of the solar energy measure financed by the utilities is deceptive, and the justices should not allow it to go to the fall ballot. The amendment is an attempt to block the private market for solar in Florida, not to expand consumer choice, and voters should not be confronted with the sneak attack." They also stated, "Amendment 1 is a solar scam, and all of the millions being spent by the utility companies to protect their bottom line won't change that. This is a cynical effort to stop the clock, artificially inflate the price of solar, and keep the market uncertain enough to drive away competition. On Amendment 1, the Tampa Bay Times recommends voting no." For opposition, as you can see, we have the Tampa Bay Times, the Ocala Star-Banner, Bradenton Herald, Gainesville Sun, Herald Tribune, Sun Sentinel, Folio Weekly, Palm Beach Post, Cape Coral Daily Breeze. The Cape Coral Daily Breeze states, "Do not be fooled by this ballot initiative. It is not pro-solar. Vote no on Amendment 1. Northwest Florida Daily News says, editorial, "Amendment 1 is not a friend of solar users." Alright, so having said that, and looking at who is funding what side of this argument, this is the biggest scam that is on the ballot in November. Amendment 1, you have to say no to it. You have to vote no on Amendment 1. It hurts the state, it hurts solar energy in general. All it does is strengthen the power companies.